You're looking at a man with no hands, no nose. Half his face is missing, reconstructed with skin grafts and surgeries. He's standing in front of you, smiling, telling you a story. I died on Mount Everest, he says. I was dead for 18 hours. No pulse, no breathing, skin frozen solid. My climbing team checked my vitals, pronounced me dead, and left me there. You stare at him. This man is alive, standing, talking, but he's telling you he was dead. I woke up, he continues, alone in a tent, in the middle of a storm, at 26,000 feet, and I had no idea how I was still alive. His name is Beck Weathers. He's a pathologist from Texas, and on May 11th, 1996, during the deadliest disaster in Everest history, Beck was left for dead, twice. The first time, his team abandoned him during a blizzard, assuming he'd freeze to death overnight. The second time, rescuers checked his body the next morning, found no pulse, and declared him dead. They covered him with a sleeping bag and walked away. But 18 hours after being left for dead, Beck Weathers woke up, opened his eyes, stood up, and walked back to camp, alone, in the middle of a storm, with frostbite so severe his hands were frozen into claws and his face was a mask of ice. He should have died. Every medical expert who's studied his case says he should have died, but he didn't. This is the story of Beck Weathers, the man who died on Everest and refused to stay dead, the climber who was abandoned twice and survived both times, and the miracle that no one, not even Beck himself, can fully explain. This is that story. Beck Weathers was a 49-year-old pathologist from Dallas, Texas. He had a wife, 2 children, and a successful medical practice. He wasn't a professional mountaineer. He wasn't an elite athlete. He was a middle-aged doctor with a passion for climbing mountains. And in May 1996, he was living his dream, attempting to summit Mount Everest. Beck had joined Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants expedition, one of the most respected guiding companies on Everest. Rob Hall was legendary. He'd summited Everest 4 times. He had an impeccable safety record, and he promised clients a 90% success rate. Beck trusted him completely, but Beck had a problem. His eyes, specifically. He'd undergone radial keratotomy surgery years earlier, a procedure to correct nearsightedness. The surgery had an unexpected side effect. At extreme altitude, Beck's corneas swelled, causing temporary blindness. His doctors had warned him, don't climb above 25,000 feet. The altitude could make you blind. Beck climbed anyway, because he wanted the summit, and he believed he could manage the risk. On May 10th, 1996, Beck and the rest of Rob Hall's team left camp for 26,000 feet at midnight, beginning their summit push. The plan was simple: climb through the night, summit at sunrise, descend before afternoon storms made conditions dangerous. But as Beck climbed higher, his vision began to fail. By the time he reached 27,500 feet, a flat area known as the balcony, he was nearly blind. He could see light and shadows, but no details, no features, no route. Rob Hall assessed Beck's condition and made a decision. You can't continue, your vision's too compromised. Wait here, I'll pick you up on the way down. Beck agreed. He sat down on the balcony at 27,500 feet and waited for hours as climbers passed him on their way to the summit, as the sun rose, as the temperature dropped, as his body slowly froze. Around 3 p.m., 15 hours after leaving Camp before, Rob Hall and other climbers descended past Beck. His vision had improved slightly, and he begged them, "Let me come with you, I can see well enough now." But a guide named Mike Groom assessed the situation and said, "It's too late. A storm's coming. We need to descend fast. Can you keep up?" Beck said yes. So Groom allowed him to join the descent group, a decision that would nearly kill everyone. By 5 p.m., the storm hit, a massive blizzard. Wind speeds exceeded 100 mph. Visibility dropped to 0. Temperature plummeted to 40 degrees with wind chills reaching 100 degrees above. And the descent group, Beck, Mike Groom and several other climbers became disoriented. They were lost at 27,000 feet in a whiteout. With darkness falling, Groom tried to lead them down, but without visibility, without landmarks, he couldn't find the route. They were walking in circles, burning through oxygen, freezing, and slowly dying. Around 7 p.m., Groom made a desperate decision. "We can't keep moving. We'll walk off a cliff. Everyone huddle together. We'll wait for the storm to pass." The group sat down in the snow, huddled together for warmth, and waited for hours as the storm raged, as their body temperatures dropped, as frostbite turned their hands and feet black. Beck later described the experience. "I knew I was dying. I could feel my body shutting down. My hands were frozen into claws, my face was numb, and I thought, this is it. This is how I die, on a mountain, in a storm, surrounded by strangers." Some members of the group, those with more strength, more oxygen, better vision, decided to try walking again. Mike Groom led a small group down through the storm, leaving Beck and several others behind. They promised to send help, but help never came. Because by the time Groom reached camp, he was hypothermic, frostbitten, and barely conscious. He'd done everything he could, and it wasn't enough. Beck Weathers and the others were left on the mountain, in the storm, dying. When dawn broke on May 11th, a rescue team climbed from Camp 4 to search for survivors. They found Beck lying in the snow, face down, covered in ice, not moving. The rescuers checked for signs of life. No pulse, no breathing, skin frozen solid. Beck Weathers was dead. They moved him slightly, rolling him over to confirm, and saw his face. It was a frozen mask, eyes closed, skin white and waxy. Frostbite had blackened his hands and nose. He looked like a corpse, because he was a corpse. The rescuers covered him with a sleeping bag, said a prayer, and left him there, because at 27,000 feet you can't carry bodies down. You can barely keep yourself alive, and Beck was dead. There was nothing they could do. Except Beck wasn't dead. Or more accurately, he'd been clinically dead. No detectable pulse, no breathing, body temperature so low that medical instruments couldn't register it. But some part of his brain, some deep survival mechanism, was still functioning, barely, invisibly waiting. And 18 hours after being left for dead, Beck Weathers woke up. He opened his eyes, saw grey sky, felt wind, and thought, "I'm alive." His right arm was frozen solid, extended above his head, locked in position, useless. His left arm was barely mobile. His hands were frozen into claws, fingers black with frostbite. His face was numb, covered in ice, and he was alone. Beck tried to sit up. Failed. Tried again. Fell back. On the third attempt, he managed to roll onto his side, then to his knees. Then, slowly, agonizingly, he stood. He was standing at 27,000 feet, with no idea where camp was, alone. No radio, no guide, no help coming. And he made a decision. I'm going to walk. I'm going to find camp, or I'm going to die trying. Beck Weathers took his first step, then another and another, stumbling, falling, getting up, walking blind, his vision still impaired, his eyes swollen from frostbite, following nothing but instinct and the faint memory of the route. And somehow, impossibly, he found Camp 4. When climbers at Camp 4 saw a figure stumbling toward them through the wind and snow, they thought it was a hallucination. Then they recognized the clothing, the jacket, and someone screamed, "That's Beck! Beck's alive!" The man they'd left for dead had walked back from the dead, and no one could believe it. How did Beck Weathers survive 18 hours in the death zone, exposed to temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius with no shelter, no oxygen, and no detectable vital signs? Medical experts who've studied Beck's case have theories, but no definitive answers, because what happened to Beck shouldn't be possible. Humans don't survive those conditions, ever. Theory 1, extreme hypothermia. the hibernation effect. Dr. Kenneth Kamler, a physician who was at Everest Base Camp during the 1996 disaster and later examined Beck, believes Beck entered a state of extreme hypothermia so severe that his body essentially shut down into a hibernation-like
Normal
state.
body temperature, 98.6 degrees, 37 degrees C. Mild hypothermia, 95 degrees, 35 degrees C. Severe hypothermia, 82 degrees, 28 degrees C. Clinical death, below 75 degrees, 24 degrees C. When rescuers checked Beck on the morning of May 11th, his body temperature was likely below 75 degrees, low enough that his heart rate had slowed to 1 to 2 beats per minute, his breathing was imperceptible, and his pulse was undetectable with standard field equipment. At this temperature, the body enters a state called metabolic suppression. The brain reduces oxygen consumption to 10 to 15% of normal levels. The heart barely beats, breathing nearly stops, but the brain, the most critical organ, is protected just enough to stay alive. Dr. Kamler explains, Beck was in a state we call suspended animation. He wasn't alive in any conventional sense, but he wasn't completely dead either. His brain was hanging on by a thread, and when his body temperature slowly rose, either from sunlight or some internal metabolic process, he woke up. But this theory has problems, because people in extreme hypothermia don't just wake up. They need external warming, heated blankets, warm IV fluids, hospital intervention. Beck woke up on his own, in a blizzard, and then walked. That shouldn't be possible. Theory 2, the mammalian diving reflex. Another theory involves the mammalian diving reflex, a physiological response where the body, when exposed to extreme cold, redirects blood flow away from extremities and toward vital organs, heart, brain, lungs. This reflex is triggered in mammals, including humans, when the face is submerged in cold water. It causes heart rate to slow dramatically, blood vessels in limbs to constrict blood to concentrate in the core. Beck's face was covered in ice, exposed to wind and sub-zero temperatures. It's possible this triggered the diving reflex, protecting his brain and heart while sacrificing his extremities, hands, feet, nose. But again, this reflex explains survival for minutes, maybe an hour, not 18 hours. Theory 3, pre-existing condition. Thicker blood. Beck was a pathologist. He understood human physiology intimately, and years after his survival, he revealed something interesting. He'd been taking medication for depression, specifically a class of drugs that can affect blood viscosity, thickness. Some researchers speculate that Beck's blood was thicker than normal, which could have slowed heat loss and protected his organs longer than expected. But Beck himself dismisses this theory. I don't think the medication mattered. I think I just got lucky, incredibly, impossibly lucky. Theory 4, willpower and hallucination. The most mysterious element of Beck's survival isn't the 18 hours he was dead. It's what happened when he woke up. Beck later described a vision, a hallucination that occurred while he was unconscious. I saw my wife, Peach, and my kids. They were standing in front of me. And Peach said, Beck, you have to come home. The kids need you, I need you. And I felt this overwhelming sense of obligation, like I couldn't die. Not yet. Not here. Beck believes this vision, this hallucination, triggered something in his brain, some survival mechanism, some refusal to give up. Dr. Kamler calls this the will to live phenomenon. We've documented cases where people in extreme conditions survive because they have something to live for, a reason to keep fighting. Beck had his family, and that might have been the difference between life and death. But medical science can't explain how willpower translates to physical survival, how wanting to live can restart a heart that's barely beating, how hallucinations can warm a frozen body. Theory 5, no one really knows. The honest answer is, no one knows why Beck survived. Dr. Kamler, who studied Beck's case for decades, admits, I can give you theories.
I can explain the physiology of extreme hypothermia, but the truth is, Beck shouldn't be alive. Every medical principle says he should have died, and yet he's here, talking, living, raising his kids, and I can't fully explain it. Beck himself has said, people want a scientific explanation. They want to understand how I survived. But I don't have one. I just woke up, and I walked, and somehow I made it. And I'm grateful every day. But I can't tell you why. An outlier, a statistical impossibility that happened anyway, and it raises an uncomfortable question. How many other climbers, left for dead on Everest, might have survived if someone had waited a little longer, checked one more time, refused to give up? We'll never know, because the mountain doesn't give second chances, except, apparently, when it does. And Beck Weathers is proof that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, the mountain lets you go. When Beck Weathers woke up after 18 hours lying in the snow at 27,000 feet, he faced an impossible situation. He was alone. His team had left him for dead. Blind, his eyes were swollen, nearly shut from frostbite. Frozen, his hands were black claws, his face was an ice mask. Disoriented, hypoxia and hypothermia had impaired his memory. Lost, he had no idea which direction camp was. Most people in this situation would lie back down, wait for rescue, and die waiting. Because rescue wasn't coming, everyone thought Beck was dead, but Beck didn't lie down. He stood up and he started walking. The first steps. Beck later described the moment he regained consciousness. I opened my eyes and saw grey sky, and my first thought was, I'm still on the mountain, and my second thought was, I'm alive, and my third thought was, I need to move or I'm going to die. Beck's right arm was frozen solid, extended above his head, locked in position by rigor mortis-like stiffness. His left arm could move slightly, but his hands were useless. His fingers were frozen into claws, black with frostbite, unresponsive, dead tissue. He tried to stand, fell, tried again, fell. On the third attempt, he managed to get to his knees. Then, using his frozen right arm as a brace, he pushed himself upright. Standing at 27,000 feet after 18 hours of exposure should have killed him instantly. The act of standing, the cardiovascular stress, the blood pressure changes, the demand for oxygen should have caused his heart to stop. But it didn't. Beck took his first step. His legs were stiff, his feet were numb, but they worked. Barely. He took another step, and another, moving like a zombie, stumbling, swaying, but moving forward. The problem, which direction? Beck couldn't see clearly. His vision was blurred from corneal swelling and frostbite damage. He could make out shapes, light, shadows, but no details, no landmarks, no route markers. And Camp 4, the only place on the mountain with shelter, oxygen, and people who could save him, could be in any direction. A wrong turn would send him off a cliff, into a crevasse, or deeper into the death zone, where he'd collapse and die within minutes. Beck had to guess, and he chose to follow his instincts. I remembered that when we'd climbed up from camp, the sun had been on my left. Beck later explained. So I figured if I walked with the sun on my right, I'd be going generally downhill, toward camp. It was a guess, based on a vague memory of sun position from the day before. And if he was wrong, he'd die. Beck walked, for what felt like hours but was probably 20 to 30 minutes, stumbling, falling, getting up, falling again. His body was shutting down. His brain was screaming at him to stop, to rest, to sit down. But sitting down meant death. Beck knew that. The moment someone saw him. Stuart Hutchison, a Canadian climber who was at Camp 4, was standing outside his tent, looking up the mountain through the thinning storm. He saw something moving, a figure, stumbling, swaying. Hutchison's first thought, hallucination. The altitude was making him see things, but the figure kept moving, getting closer, and Hutchison realized, that's a person. Someone's up there, alive. Hutchison called to others, someone's coming down. Someone's walking into camp! Climbers emerged from tents, stared up the slope, and as the figure got closer, someone recognized the clothing, the jacket, the build. That's Beck! That's Beck Weathers! The camp erupted in shock, because Beck was dead. They'd checked him that morning. No pulse, no breathing, dead. And yet here he was, walking, alive. Todd Burleson, another guide, he ran up the slope, steadied him and shouted, "Beck, Beck, can you hear me?" Beck mumbled something incoherent. His lips were frozen. His face was covered in ice, but he was conscious, aware, alive. Burleson and Hutchison helped Beck down the final 100 meters into camp. When Beck reached the tents, he collapsed, conscious but unable to move any further. The condition of his body. When doctors examined Beck at Camp Fort, they were horrified. Hands, frozen solid, black with frostbite, fingers locked into claws, dead tissue, unsalvageable, face, severe frostbite, nose black, cheeks and forehead showing signs of tissue death, eyes swollen nearly shut, corneas damaged, vision severely impaired, core temperature dangerously low, though slowly rising, mental state confused, disoriented, but conscious. Dr. Kamler, who was radioed from base camp, gave his assessment. Beck needs immediate evacuation. He'll die from infection, hypothermia, or organ failure. We need to get him down now. But there was a problem. Beck couldn't walk any further. And at 26,000 feet, helicopters can't fly. The air is too thin. Rotors can't generate enough lift. Beck was stuck at Camp 4, dying slowly, with no way down. The impossible rescue, Beck's wife, Peach, was in Dallas when she received a satellite phone call from Everest Base Camp. The message was devastating. Beck is alive, but he's dying. He can't descend on his own, and we can't carry him. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. Peach refused to accept that. She contacted the U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu. She called the Nepali government, she contacted helicopter companies, and she begged, someone has to try, someone has to at least try. One pilot, Madan KC, a legendary Nepali helicopter pilot, agreed to attempt a rescue. But he made clear, I've never flown to 26,000 feet. No one has. The helicopter might not make it. I might crash, but I'll try. On the morning of May 13th, 2 days after Beck walked back into camp, Madan KC flew his B-2 Squirrel helicopter up the Khumbu Valley, through the icefall, and toward Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. It was the highest helicopter rescue in history, and it should have been impossible. But the pilots stripped everything from the helicopter seats, extra fuel, equipment, to reduce weight. He flew at dawn when the air was coldest and densest, and he hovered for just 30 seconds, long enough for Beck to be loaded aboard, before diving back down toward base camp. Beck Weathers had survived 18 hours dead, walked back from the grave, and now he was flying off the mountain in a helicopter that shouldn't have been able to reach him. The impossible had happened. Again, Beck Weathers survived Everest, but survival came with a price paid in flesh, bone, and permanent disfigurement. When Beck arrived at a hospital in Kathmandu, doctors assessed the damage, and the prognosis was grim. The hands, both of Beck's hands, were completely destroyed. The frostbite had penetrated deep into the tissue, past skin, past muscle, into bone. The fingers were black, necrotic, dead tissue, and unsalvageable. Doctors explained to Beck, we need to amputate both hands. There's no saving them. The tissue is dead. If we don't remove it, infection will spread and kill you. Beck asked, how much are you taking? The doctor showed him everything below the wrists. Beck would lose both hands, completely. No fingers, no palms, just stumps ending at the wrist. Beck later described his reaction. I was devastated. I'm a pathologist. My hands are my career. Without them, I can't work, can't perform surgery, can't examine tissue samples. My professional life was over, but there was no choice. On May 15, 1996, Beck underwent bilateral hand amputation. Surgeons removed both hands at the wrists. When Beck woke from surgery, he stared at the bandaged stumps where his hands used to be. And he wept. The face. Beck's face had also suffered severe frostbite. His nose was completely destroyed. His cheeks and forehead showed deep tissue damage, and his right ear was partially frozen. Doctors explained, "We'll need to remove the dead tissue. Reconstruct your face with skin grafts. It'll take multiple surgeries over several years, and you'll never look the same." Beck's nose was amputated, completely removed down to the bone. Later, surgeons would reconstruct a new nose using cartilage from his ribs and skin from his forehead. But for months, Beck had no nose, just a hole in the center of his face. His cheeks required debridement, removal of dead tissue, and skin grafts. His forehead needed reconstructive surgery. His right ear needed partial amputation. By the time doctors finished the immediate surgeries, Beck's face was unrecognizable. He looked like a burn victim, a trauma survivor, a man who'd been through war. The emotional toll. Beck's physical injuries were devastating, but the emotional and psychological toll was even worse. He'd gone to Everest as a successful doctor, a husband, a father. He'd come home as a double amputee with a disfigured face. He couldn't work, couldn't perform basic tasks like eating, dressing, or using the bathroom without assistance. He was completely dependent on his wife, Peach, and his children. Beck fell into severe depression. He questioned whether survival had been worth it, whether it would have been better to die on the mountain than to live like this, disabled, disfigured, dependent. In his book, Left for Dead, Beck wrote, "There were days I wished I'd died on Everest, days where I looked at my stumps, my face, my useless body and thought, what's the point? Why did I survive if this is what survival looks like?" Peach later revealed that Beck contemplated suicide multiple times in the months after returning home. He'd say things like, "You'd be better off without me. The kids would be better off." And I'd have to convince him that wasn't true, that we needed him, that he was still their father, still my husband, still Beck. The reconstructive surgeries. Over the next 2 years, Beck underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries. Nose reconstruction. Surgeons harvested cartilage from Beck's ribs and skin from his forehead to build a new nose. The result was functional, but noticeably different from his original nose. Slightly misshapen, scarred, but able to breathe. Cheek and forehead grafts. Skin was taken from Beck's thighs and grafted onto his face to cover the areas where frostbite had destroyed tissue. Prosthetic hands. Beck was fitted with prosthetic attachments for his stumps. These weren't functional hands. He couldn't manipulate objects with precision, but they allowed him to perform basic tasks like holding a cup, opening doors, typing on a keyboard with adaptive tools. The surgeries were painful, expensive, and never-ending. Even today, decades later, Beck requires periodic medical interventions to manage scar tissue, nerve pain, and complications from the amputations. Learning to live again. Beck had to relearn everything. How to eat, how to dress, how to write, how to shower, how to hug his children. Simple tasks became monumental challenges. Eating. Beck couldn't hold utensils. He had to use adaptive tools, forks and spoons attached to his prosthetics. Writing. He learned to type using voice recognition software and adaptive keyboards. Driving. Specially modified controls allowed him to drive with his prosthetics. Hugging. This was the hardest. Beck's children were initially afraid of his stumps, and Beck had to teach them, slowly, patiently, that he was still their dad, still the same person, just different. Beck's daughter, Meg, later described her reaction. "When Dad came home from the hospital, I didn't recognize him. His face was bandaged, his hands were gone, and I was scared. But Mom told me, 'That's your father. He climbed a mountain, and he came home, and he's still here, and you need to love him.' And I did. It took time, but I did. The medical career. Beck's medical career as a pathologist was over. He couldn't perform the fine motor tasks required, examining tissue under a microscope, performing autopsies, handling surgical instruments. But Beck found a new path, speaking and writing. He wrote a book about his experience, Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest, which became a bestseller. He gave speeches at medical conferences, corporate events, and motivational seminars. He shared his story, the survival, the amputations, the recovery, with audiences around the world, and he found meaning in it, purpose, a way to turn his tragedy into something positive. Beck later said, "I lost my hands, I lost my face, but I didn't lose my life, and I didn't lose my family, and that's what matters. I survived." And survival, no matter the cost, is a gift, the uncomfortable question. But there's a question that haunts Beck's story. Was survival worth it? Beck paid an unimaginable price. His hands, his face, his career, years of pain and surgeries, a lifetime of disability, and trauma that never fully heals. Would it have been better to die on the mountain, painlessly, relatively, quickly, while still whole? Beck's answer, no, I got to grow
because
old
I got
with
to see
my
my
kids grow up. I got to live, and that's worth everything. But not everyone who hears his story agrees, and that's the uncomfortable truth about survival on Everest. Sometimes, living costs more than dying, and you don't get to choose the price. Beck Weathers' survival is extraordinary, but it occurred during the deadliest disaster in Everest history at the time, May 10–11, 1996. 8 people died in 2 days. And Beck was just one of dozens who nearly died. To understand Beck's survival, you need to understand the disaster that should have killed him. The setup, May 10th, 1996, began with perfect weather, clear skies, light winds, ideal summit conditions, and multiple expeditions, adventure consultants led by Rob Hall, Mountain Madness led by Scott Fisher, a Taiwanese team, an Indian team, and others, all decided to summit on the same day. This created bottlenecks at the Hillary Step, delays, and by early afternoon, many climbers were still high on the mountain, far past safe turnaround times. Rob Hall had a strict rule: turn around by 2 p.m., no matter how close you are to the summit. Because summiting late means descending in the dark, in exhaustion with depleted oxygen. And that's when people die. But on May 10th, Hall broke his own rule. He was guiding a client, a Doug Hansen, who'd failed to summit the previous year. Hansen was struggling, moving slowly, but Hall stayed with him, pushed him forward, and they didn't reach the summit until after 4 p.m., 2 hours past turnaround time. The storm, around 5 p.m., a massive storm hit, blizzard conditions. Wind speeds exceeded 100 mph. Visibility dropped to 0. Temperatures plummeted. Climbers descending from the summit were caught in the storm, disoriented, lost, running out of oxygen, and dying. The 8 who died. 1. Rob Hall, New Zealand, 35 years old. Rob Hall was one of the most experienced Everest guides in the world, but on May 10th he made fatal mistakes. He stayed with Doug Hansen too long, summited too late, and got trapped high on the mountain when the storm hit. Rob spent the night near the south summit at 28,700 feet, alone, freezing, and running out of oxygen. He made satellite phone calls to base camp and to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was 7 months pregnant. Rob's last call to Jan is heartbreaking. "Hi, my sweetheart. I hope you're tucked up in a nice, warm bed. How are you doing?" Jan, "I'm okay, but I'm worried about you." Rob, "Don't worry too much." Those were his last words. Rob Hall died on the morning of May 11th, sitting near the south summit, frozen to death. Doug Hansen, USA, 46 years old. Doug died near the summit. He'd pushed too hard, stayed too long, and collapsed on the descent. His body was never recovered. 3. Scott Fisher, USA, 40 years old. Scott Fisher was the leader of Mountain Madness, a competing expedition company. He was experienced, charismatic, and confident. But on May 10th, he was sick. He'd been suffering from altitude sickness for days, but pushed through anyway. On the descent, he collapsed at 27,200 feet. Sherpas tried to help him, but couldn't move him. Scott Fisher died overnight, sitting in the snow. 4. Yasuko Namba, Japan, 47 years old. Yasuko was attempting to become the oldest woman to complete the 7 summits, the highest peak on each continent. Everest was her final mountain. She summited successfully but collapsed on the descent. She was part of the same group as Beck Weathers, huddled together in the storm. When rescuers found her the next morning, she was unconscious. No pulse. She was left for dead, just like Beck. But unlike Beck, Yasuko never woke up. 5. Andy Harris, New Zealand, 31 years old. Andy was one of Rob Hall's guides. He disappeared during the storm. His body was never found. It's believed he fell or walked off a cliff in the whiteout conditions. 6. Tsewang Smanla, India, 29 years old. 7. Tsewang Paljor, India, 28 years old. India, 25 years old. 8. These 3 Indian climbers were part of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition attempting the Northeast Ridge. They summited late, got caught in the storm, and all 3 died. Paljor's body became the famous Green Boots landmark. Why did 8 people die? The disaster was caused by multiple failures. 1. Overcrowding. Too many climbers summiting on the same day created bottlenecks and delays. 2. Ignoring turnaround times. Rob Hall and Scott Fisher both broke the 2 p.m. turnaround rule. If they'd descended earlier, they'd have survived. 3. Client inexperience. Many clients lacked the skills and judgment to recognize danger. They relied entirely on guides. 4. Guide pressure. Guides felt pressure to get clients to the summit. Their reputations and businesses depended on high success rates. 5. Hubris. Experienced climbers like Hall and Fisher believed they could manage the risks. They were wrong. The aftermath. The 1996 disaster shocked the climbing world. It exposed the dangers of commercial Everest expeditions, and it raised uncomfortable questions. Should inexperienced climbers be allowed on Everest? Should guides prioritize client summits over safety? Is Everest too crowded? These questions are still debated today, and they're still unanswered. Beck's role in the disaster. Beck wasn't responsible for any of the deaths, but his survival occurred in the context of this disaster, and his story became inseparable from it. John Krakauer, a journalist who was on Rob Hall's team and survived, wrote a book about the disaster into thin air. The book became a bestseller, and Beck's survival was one of the most dramatic elements, but Krakauer's account was controversial. Beck and others disputed some details, argued that Krakauer misrepresented events, and the controversy continues to this day. The uncomfortable truth. 8 people died on May 10th, 11th, 1996. Beck Weathers nearly became the 9th, but he survived, not because he was stronger or smarter or better prepared, but because he got lucky, because his body somehow survived 18 hours of exposure, because a pilot was willing to attempt an impossible rescue, and Beck knows it. "I survived because of luck," he said. Nothing more. Rob Hall was a better climber than me. Scott Fisher was more experienced. Yasuko Namba was tougher, and they all died. And I lived. That's not fair. It's just luck. And that's the cruelest truth about Everest. Survival isn't determined by skill or strength or preparation. It's determined by luck. And on May 10th, 1996, Beck Weathers got lucky, and 8 others didn't. Beck Weathers came home from Everest in May 1996 as a different person, physically, emotionally, psychologically. He'd lost his hands, his face, and parts of his identity. But slowly, painfully, he rebuilt his life. The first year, depression and rehabilitation. The first year after Everest was the hardest. Beck underwent multiple surgeries, learned to use prosthetics, and battled severe depression. I felt useless, couldn't contribute. Beck later wrote, I was a burden on my family, and I hated myself for it. Beck's wife, Peach, bore the brunt of his recovery. She became his caregiver, his nurse, his emotional support, and it strained their marriage. There were times I wanted to leave, Peach admitted in interviews, not because I didn't love Beck, but because it was so hard, watching him suffer, watching him give up, and not being able to fix it. But Peach stayed. And slowly, Beck began to heal, rediscovering purpose. Beck couldn't return to medicine, but he discovered a new calling, sharing his story. In 1999, Beck co-wrote a book with journalist Stephen Michaud, Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest. The book detailed Beck's experience on Everest, his survival, his recovery, and the lessons he'd learned. The book was a bestseller, and it launched Beck's career as a motivational speaker. The speaking career. Beck began giving speeches at corporate events, medical conferences, and motivational seminars. He spoke about survival, how he survived 18 hours in the death zone, resilience, how he rebuilt his life after catastrophic injury, perspective, how near death changed his priorities. Audiences responded powerfully. Because Beck's story wasn't just about Everest, it was about facing impossible odds, about refusing to give up, about finding meaning in suffering. One attendee at a 2005 speech said, I expected a story about climbing, but what I got was a story about life, about how we all face storms and how we choose to respond. Beck's speeches weren't polished or rehearsed. He was blunt, honest, sometimes uncomfortably so. He talked about his depression, his suicidal thoughts, his failures as a husband and father before Everest. And I wasn't a good husband before Everest, Beck admitted in speeches. I was obsessed with climbing, with achieving, with proving something, and I neglected my family. Everest forced me to confront that, to realize what actually matters. The marriage. Beck and Peach's marriage survived, but it required work, therapy, hard conversations, and a willingness to forgive. Beck came home a different person, Peach said, and I had to decide, the one with can no I love hands, this new person? No career, no confidence, and the answer was yes, but it wasn't easy. Beck credits Peach with saving his life, not on Everest, but after. Peach is the reason I'm alive, Beck said. She could have left, should have left, but she stayed, and she fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. The children, Beck's children, Meg and Bub, were teenagers when their father returned from Everest, and they struggled to adjust. Dad was different, Meg said. He looked different, he acted different, and for a while it was hard. I didn't know how to relate to him. But over time, the family healed, and Beck became closer to his children than he'd ever been before Everest. Before Everest, Dad was always climbing, Meg said, always training, always gone. But after Everest, he was present. He couldn't climb anymore, and that was a gift. So he had time for prosthetics. Beck's prosthetic hands improved over time. In the early 2000s, he was fitted with myoelectric prosthetics, advanced artificial hands controlled by muscle signals in his forearms. These prosthetics allowed Beck to perform tasks that had been impossible with earlier models. Typing on a keyboard, holding objects, shaking hands awkwardly, but functionally. But Beck was honest about the limitations. I'll never play piano, never perform surgery, never feel my wife's hand in mine. The prosthetics are functional, but they're not hands. The documentaries. Beck's story has been featured in multiple documentaries. One, Storm Over Everest, 2008. A PBS Frontline documentary about the 1996 disaster. Beck was interviewed extensively. 2, Everest, 2015. A Hollywood film based on the 1996 disaster. Beck was portrayed by actor Josh Brolin. Beck consulted on the film,
But Hollywood
and
can't
said
capture
they
what it
got it
actually
mostly
feels
right.
like
To be dying on a mountain. 3. Into Thin Air, Death on Everest, 1997, a made-for-TV movie. Beck was also portrayed in this film. These films brought Beck's story to millions of people, and they cemented his place in Everest history. The lessons. Beck has been asked thousands of times, "What did you learn from Everest?" His answer has evolved over the years, but the core message remains consistent. Everest taught me what matters and what doesn't. Before Everest, I thought achievement mattered, summits, success, proving myself. But after Everest, I realized none of that matters. What matters is family, love, being present. Everest took my hands, but it gave me perspective, and I'm grateful for that, even if the price was high. Beck also speaks about the dangers of obsession. I was obsessed with climbing. It consumed me, and it nearly killed me, and I see that same obsession in other people, in their careers, their hobbies, their ambitions, and I tell them, be careful, because obsession blinds you, and when you're blind, you walk off cliffs. The controversy. Not everyone views Beck's story positively. Some critics argue Beck was reckless, climbing despite his eye condition. Beck's survival was pure luck, not heroism. Beck profits from a tragedy that killed 8 people. Beck acknowledges these criticisms. I was reckless. I did climb despite warnings. And yes, I got lucky. I don't claim to be a hero. I'm a survivor, and I'm trying to use my survival to help others. That's all. Today, Beck is in his late 70s. He still gives occasional speeches, still wears his prosthetics, still carries the scars, physical and emotional, from Everest, and he's at peace. I've lived a full life, Beck says, more than I had any right to expect after Everest, and I'm grateful, because Beck Weathers died on Everest, and then he came back, and he's spent the last 25+ years proving that survival, no matter the cost, is worth fighting for. Beck Weathers. Survival challenges everything we know about human physiology. Medical experts have studied his case for decades, trying to understand how he survived conditions that should have been universally fatal. The medical consensus: it shouldn't have happened. Dr. Kenneth Kamler, who treated climbers at Everest Base Camp during the 1996 disaster and later examined Beck extensively, has stated repeatedly, by every medical principle, Beck should be dead. The fact that he's alive is a statistical anomaly, an outlier, and we still don't fully understand how it happened. Here's what makes Beck's survival so medically improbable. Factor 1. Extreme hypothermia. When Beck's body temperature dropped below 75 degrees, 24 degrees, he entered a state called profound hypothermia. At this temperature, the heart beats 1 to 2 times per minute versus normal 60 to 100 BPM. Breathing is imperceptible. Brain activity 1 to 2 slows breaths per minute 0 versus most organs shut down. People in profound hypothermia look dead. They have no detectable pulse with field equipment, no visible breathing. Pupils are dilated and non-reactive. Skin is cold and stiff. The medical saying is, you're not dead until you're warm and dead. This means that hypothermic patients should be warmed before being declared dead. Because sometimes, rarely, people in profound hypothermia can be revived with external warming, heated blankets, warm IV fluids, cardiopulmonary bypass. But Beck wasn't warmed externally. He woke up on his own. His body somehow generated enough heat internally to restart normal function, and medical science can't fully explain how. Factor 2. Time. Most cases of successful revival from profound hypothermia involve victims who were cold for minutes to a few hours. The longest documented survival from profound hypothermia is approximately 6 hours. Beck was in profound hypothermia for 18 hours. No one survives 18 hours at that temperature. Except Beck did. Factor 3. Altitude. Profound hypothermia is deadly at sea level, where oxygen is abundant. At 27,000 feet, where oxygen is scarce, it should be impossible to survive. because even if Beck's body somehow stayed alive, his brain was being starved of oxygen. Deprivation causes permanent brain damage after just 4 to 6 minutes. Beck was hypoxic for 18 hours. He should have woken up with severe brain damage, cognitive impairment, memory loss, inability to speak or walk, but he didn't. Beck woke up with his mental faculties intact, disoriented, yes, but cognitively functional, and that's medically inexplicable. Factor 4. Frostbite and circulation. Severe frostbite causes blood vessels
This cuts off circulation
to extremities, hands, feet, nose. Once circulation is cut off for more than a few hours, the tissue dies permanently. Beck's hands were frozen for 18 hours. By all logic, they should have been completely dead, unable to move, unable to function. But when Beck woke up, he was able to use his arms, move his stumps, generate enough motor control to walk. His hands were dead and later amputated, but his arms worked. And doctors can't explain how the circulation to his arms was preserved while his hands were destroyed. Possible explanations. Medical researchers have proposed several theories. Theory 1. The Lazarus effect. The Lazarus effect refers to cases where patients declared dead spontaneously revive. It's rare, but documented. Usually, it occurs when CPR or other interventions increase pressure in the chest. The pressure slowly builds up blood flow to the heart. The heart spontaneously restarts, but Beck didn't receive CPR. No one was performing interventions. So this theory doesn't fully apply. Theory 2. Metabolic suppression. Some researchers believe Beck's body entered a state of extreme metabolic suppression, similar to hibernation in animals. In this state, metabolism drops to 10 to 15% of normal oxygen consumption plummets. Brain and heart are protected just enough to stay alive. This is the most plausible theory, but it's never been documented in humans at this extreme level. And it doesn't explain how Beck woke up without external warming. Theory 3. Genetic factors. Some people have genetic variations that make them more resistant to cold. For example, thicker blood, slower heat loss, higher brown fat levels generates heat more efficiently. Genetic adaptations from cold climate ancestry. Beck has no known genetic testing indicating these factors, but it's possible he has unidentified genetic advantages that helped him survive. Theory 4. Willpower. This is the least scientific but most compelling theory. Beck's vision of his family, his hallucination of Peach telling him to come home, may have triggered a powerful psychological response that translated into physiological survival. The will to live is documented in medical literature. People with strong motivations to survive often outlast statistical predictions, but medical science can't explain the mechanism. How does wanting to live restart a frozen heart? The uncomfortable truth. We don't know. After decades of study, medical experts still can't definitively explain Beck's survival. They can offer theories, hypotheses, educated guesses, but no conclusive explanation. Dr. Kamler summarizes, Beck's survival is a medical mystery, and it probably always will be, because there are elements of human physiology and human consciousness that we don't fully understand. Beck survived because of a combination of factors: luck, physiology, psychology, and perhaps something we can't measure. And that's okay. Sometimes medicine doesn't have all the answers. What Beck's case teaches us: Beck's survival has implications for 1. Emergency medicine. You're not dead until you're warm, and dead has become a guiding principle. Hypothermic patients should be warmed before being declared dead. 2. Search and rescue. Beck's case suggests that people left for dead in extreme cold should be checked multiple times over hours, not minutes. 3. Human limits. Beck's case expands our understanding of human survivability. The limits of human endurance are not fixed. They're context-dependent, and sometimes people survive the unsurvivable. But Beck's case also teaches a darker lesson. Survival is rare. Beck is an outlier. For every Beck Weathers who wakes up after 18 hours, there are hundreds who don't. And assuming you'll be the exception, assuming you'll survive what shouldn't be survivable, is how people die on Everest. Beck Weathers is 77 years old now. He lives in Dallas with his wife, Peach. His children are grown. His grandchildren know him as Grandpa with the robot hands. And he's at peace. But the ghost of Everest never fully leaves. I still dream about it, Beck says. And I dream I'm lying in the snow, and I can't move, and no one's coming, and I wake up, and for a second I think I'm still there, I'm still dying, and then I realize I'm home, I'm alive, and I'm okay. The legacy. Beck's story has inspired millions. His book has sold over 500,000 copies. His speeches have reached audiences in dozens of countries, and his survival has become a symbol of resilience. But Beck is uncomfortable with being called a hero. "Oh, I'm not a hero," he insists. "Heroes make sacrifices for others. I was just trying not to die, and I got lucky." The question that haunts him. People always ask Beck, would you do it again? Knowing what you know now, knowing the cost, would you still climb Everest? Beck's answer has changed over the years. Immediately after Everest, the answer was absolutely not. Never. It cost me too much. But decades later, his answer is more nuanced. I don't know. Because Everest took everything from me, but it also gave me everything. It gave me perspective. It gave me gratitude. It gave me a second chance with my family. And it gave me a story that's helped other people. So would I do it again? I honestly don't know. The message. Beck's message to people considering Everest, or any dangerous pursuit, is blunt. Ask yourself, what are you willing to lose? Because the mountain takes, always. And it doesn't care about your dreams or your goals or your reasons. It just takes, and you need to decide, before you go, what you're willing to sacrifice. And if the answer is everything, your hands, your face, your life, then go ahead. But if the answer is anything less than everything, then don't go, because the mountain doesn't negotiate. The gratitude, despite everything, the amputations, the pain, the trauma, Beck is grateful. I got to raise my kids, he says. I got to grow old with Peach. I got to see things and do things that most people never experience. And yes, I paid a price, but I'm still here. And that's a gift. The others who didn't come back. Beck thinks often about the 8 who died in 1996. Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, Yasuko Namba, Doug Hansen, Andy Harris, the 3 Indian climbers. Why did I survive and they didn't? Beck asks. I wasn't stronger. I wasn't better prepared. I wasn't smarter. I just got lucky. And that's not fair. It's not just. But that's how Everest works. It's random, cruel, and indifferent. Beck attends memorials for the 1996 disaster. He stays in contact with survivors, and he honors the dead by telling their stories. They deserve to be remembered, Beck says, not as statistics, not as failures, but as people who dared to dream, who pushed limits, who died doing what they loved. And that's honorable, even if the outcome was tragic. The final word. Beck Weathers died on May 11, 1996, at 27,000 feet on Mount Everest. His heart stopped. His breathing stopped. His body temperature dropped below measurable levels. He was dead. And then, 18 hours later, he woke up, opened his eyes, stood, and walked. Medical science can't explain it. Experts call it a miracle. But whatever you call it, Beck Weathers is proof that sometimes, rarely, impossibly, humans survive what shouldn't be survivable. He spent 18 hours dead, and then he walked away, and he spent the last 28 years proving that survival, no matter the cost, is always worth fighting for. Because Beck Weathers refused to stay dead, and the mountain had no choice but to let him go.